All right, welcome everybody. This is the first installment of Coffee with Carl. My name is Carl Falconer. I'm the president and CEO with Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance, and it is my privilege to be here with you and to share a little bit about myself with anybody who would like to know more about me. Anyway, so today the format that we're going to use is for the first 15 minutes or so, I am going to talk about a topic in my life, how it relates to homelessness and how it relates to who I am today. And then in the last 15 minutes, I will open it up to questions from anyone in the audience that wants to ask any questions of me that they would like, and then I will try and answer them to the best of my ability. So it'll only be about 30 minutes long, a really quick segment. We're trying to do this once a month, and we'll be changing the topics from month to month, as I said. This month, I'm going to talk about growing up in South Dakota and what it was like in South Dakota. So most of you may or may not be familiar with South Dakota. As someone once said to me, I thought you had a Southern accent when I told them I was from South Dakota. No, people from South Dakota do not have Southern accents. I can attest to that. But South Dakota, as most of you know, is in the Midwest. It's located just under North Dakota, which is very close to Canada, obviously. It borders Canada, North Dakota does. So South Dakota is an interesting state. First of all, it's divided in half, or I guess most people in South Dakota kind of think of it as two halves to the state. There's the eastern half, which is where I'm from. And I'll get into where exactly I'm from in just a second. But there's also the western half. The western half is what most people know about South Dakota who don't live there or who have never been there. The western part of the state has Mount Rushmore, which most of you are familiar with, I'm sure. A lot of Native American reservations. And is primarily known for cattle in the western half. So it's very similar in some ways to the western half of Texas a little bit. Anyway, so that's the western half. The eastern half of South Dakota is different. The eastern half of South Dakota is really more known for crops, corn, soybeans, things like that. It's primarily flat, and there are also cattle in the eastern half of the state, but most of the cattle in the eastern half really are dairy cattle. The cattle in the western half are really beef cattle. And so it's two very kind of different terrains within the state. It's not very heavily populated state. It's very, it's not very diverse in South Dakota. South Dakota is one of those states when and if you were watching any election coverage, they usually announce with 0% reporting that someone has already won the election, because it pretty much goes the same way that it always does, depending on who the candidates are. So I grew up in a town called Smet. That's capital D, E, capital S, M, E, T. Smet is in the eastern half of South Dakota. As I've said, it was a very small town. At the time that I grew up in it, we had about 1,500 people. I just looked up the population again to see what the population is now. And unfortunately, and I'm going to have to talk to some of my, classmates and people back in Smet when this is over. Their population has actually dropped to less than 1,000 now, according to the latest 2020 census data that we have. So it's a very, very small town. It was named after a Catholic priest by the name of Smet, Father Smet, who is known as a missionary in trying to spread Christianity and Catholicism to Native Americans and throughout the Midwest. But what it's most famously known for is a young lady who grew up there by the name of Laura Ingalls Wilder. And some of you may have watched the show Little House on the Prairie. That is Smet. That is pretty much the Smet area. Charles Wilder, Laura's father, was one of the first residents of Smet. Laura spent most of her childhood in Smet before she moved to Minnesota after that and did some teaching and things like that, which is why Smet has now the moniker of the little town on the prairie. That's kind of our motto or our name for Smet, the little town on the prairie. And in fact, if you go there, almost every year, I'm not sure if they did it this year with COVID, but almost every year they do a Laura Ingalls Wilder pageant, which talks about Laura's life growing up there, the Wilder family, and, kind of some of the things she did while she was in Smet. There's also a tour of Smet. Smet is 1 mile by 1/2 mile wide and in depth. So it's 1 mile on one side. If you think of a rectangle, it's 1 mile by 1/2 mile large, so it's not very big. But there is a tour. You can go on the Laura Ingalls Wilder tour, and you can see a lot of different places that Laura had interactions in Smet while you're there. So growing up in a small town in rural South Dakota, I have to say it was, I thought it was a very pleasant time. I thought it was very, I don't know, innocent might be the right word, innocent time growing up there. I had a pretty good time. There were a couple of things in particular about a small town that really kind of shaped who I am and helped shape kind of where I was going and what my life was going to look like. The first story I want to tell is about delivering newspapers. When I was about 8 years old or so, and for those of you that are listening, for those of you younger generation that are listening, they used to have these things called newspapers, where you had paper, and they actually printed the news on it. So you had to wait and get these newspapers, and actually they were delivered again by delivery newspaper boys or girls. You would have to, obviously this is the way you would get a lot of your news. But I delivered newspapers. I started when I was it was my first job. I started somewhere when I was 8 or 9 years old. I was very, very young. And one of the really interesting things that I remember about delivering newspapers was I delivered newspapers in a blizzard. And for those of you not familiar with a blizzard, who've never been to snow country, that's a very, very big storm that goes through and brings a lot of wind and a lot of snow and just a lot of trouble for anyone who gets caught in a blizzard. And I remember distinctly when I was young delivering newspapers in a blizzard. It was my job. It was my job to deliver newspapers. I had a paper route of probably 40 or 50 people on the route. And I remember distinctly running through snowbanks and fighting the wind, and I was all bundled up and everything, carrying my newspapers around from house to house and delivering the newspapers. And it was interesting because the one thing I remember is that at almost every house that I stopped at, the people invited me in and gave me hot chocolate. And some had cookies and things like that. But it was really interesting because It was probably the slowest route that I had ever delivered, or slowest time on delivering my newspapers. But people just kept letting me in because obviously there's a blizzard going on, and I was a little kid and delivering newspapers, and I think most of them were pretty astonished that I was even out in it. And then there was one house outside of town. It was about half a mile outside of town that I had to go to. Most of my other route was in town, but I had to go out actually into the country about a half a mile. So I had to walk out about a half a mile to this house. And I remember distinctly going out there and just thinking to myself, this is terrible. This is just the worst. I'm out in the middle of a blizzard. I'm walking out here in the middle of nowhere, and out in the country in particular, the wind was really bad and the snow was drifting and, all that kind of stuff. But sure enough, when I got there, though, they invited me in, gave me some hot chocolate, let me get warm. And then I was back on my way back into town to deliver the rest of my route. So it was very interesting. But I think one of the things, or a couple of things that it really taught me delivering newspapers, and particularly in that blizzard, is the value of human compassion and how people really can be very, very compassionate. It also taught me the value of just people interacting with each other. I did a lot of interaction when I delivered newspapers. I was actually delivering it to their home, and a lot of people were there. And then obviously hard work. It taught me that I had to work hard if I wanted to earn money, if I wanted to earn anything in life, that I really had to work hard for it. The second story, which I've told to some people already since I've been here in Dallas, but I'll share it again because it really, I think, sets a tone for how I believe about what we should be doing for homelessness. Is when I was, I don't know, a little bit older, probably a teen, growing up in Smet. My best friend's house burned down one night. It was the middle of the night. And it was really interesting because I remember their house burned down. It was his mother, his father, and him and three brothers. So there was 6 of them total in the house. And I still remember going up to the house. It was again, middle of the night, but it woke up pretty much the entire town. And we all went up to his house, and we were there standing outside. I still remember it. And everyone got out alive, thankfully. Him and his family got out alive, and we were standing there looking at their house, which just basically burned to the ground. And I remember that at that time, what we did as a community is we divided up their family to come stay with different members of the community. We were bound and determined, and to this day, I still can't remember a day that I lived in Smet that I ever saw anyone who was homeless. And the reason is because the community wouldn't allow it. So I remember my best friend came with us, and he actually lived with us for several weeks until they could find housing for the family. But we divided the family up. Some of the family went to another neighbor. Some of the family went to some of their other family that they had. And nobody spent even 1 second out on the streets or without a home or, without a place to stay. We would not allow it as a community. And when I look back on it, I really think that that's one of the really key lessons that I learned about homelessness, and I learned about communities, is that if communities have the will and communities have the inkling, if you will, or the passion, that there wouldn't be homelessness in our country. And that's what I've been striving for since I've started working with people who are homeless, is really kind of getting back to that sense of community and really trying to help people understand that it is about community and that we can solve the problems of our neighbors, with our neighbors, for our neighbors, if we really want to, if we really have the will, we really have the passion, we really have the desire. And that's kind of where I would like to see us get back to as a community, is really taking care of each other and really making sure that nobody goes without the necessities that they need in life. So those are my stories about growing up in small town South Dakota, and I'll be happy at this point to take any questions that anybody may have.
Carl, question for you. And this
Absolutely.
is only because I filled out the PPP loan paperwork,
Yes.
and I thought you were born in South Dakota. Now, I'm not going to tell anybody where you were born because, we already had a training this week about not sharing personal information. But I was stunned to find out that you were not born in South Dakota. So explain to me how you were born in that state that we might, some people are proposing we saw off and let it drift into the sea.
I was not born in South Dakota. Both my mother and father are from South Dakota. My mother grew up in a small town near South Dakota called Iroquois, named after Iroquois Indians. My father lived in another small town called Lake Preston, which was very close to Smet. But my father joined the Navy, and so he actually went to Vietnam in the Navy. And I was actually born in Key West, Florida, at the naval base in Key West, and pretty much the furthest south space that you can be born in the contiguous United States. So I was actually born in Key West and quickly moved back to South Dakota. My mother came down here to Florida, had me, and then moved back to South Dakota pretty quickly after that. So yeah, I was actually born in Florida. Native Floridian, or as they say in Florida, I am a conch, is what they call us. People born in Florida.
You're a what?
A conch, like a conch shell.
Oh, a conch. Okay.
Conch, yes, like a conch shell. Any other questions?
Hi, this is Tammy with Hope Restored Mission. I was wondering about, I know, are you a vet? I think I heard you being a vet. And
I am.
okay, and when did that take place? And how do you feel about that in this being able to assist the vets at homeless now?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I am a vet. I'm an Army vet. I immediately getting out of high school, I went into the Army. I'll get into more depth in that probably at a later session, but I did go into the Army for 4 years. I served in active duty for 4 years. I was actually stationed in Washington, D.C. I was part of the Honor Guard. So if you ever watch any presidential scenes or anything like that, you'll see the guys in the blue uniforms. I was part of that military outfit. I did several presidential presentations, and I actually even was in an inauguration of the president. But yes, I was in the Army. I was active duty, like I said, for 4 years, and then when I moved to Jacksonville, Florida, I actually did 4 years in the National Guard, the Army National Guard as well. So yes, I'm a vet, and yeah, and I absolutely love working with vets. I do think that they are a little bit different, being a vet myself, to work with, but I absolutely love working with them, and there's nothing I love more than seeing our veterans come home, as I like to say, and move into housing. Absolutely. Any other questions? Right. I must have covered a lot of good stuff then. That's great.
What is homelessness now like right now in South Dakota? Do you know? Do you follow that?
I don't follow it for the entire state. I imagine there's probably some homeless numbers coming out of Sioux Falls, which is the largest city in South Dakota. Last time I haven't checked in quite a while, what the population is or anything like that. But there are a couple of big cities, Sioux Falls in the east and Rapid City in the west, that I'm sure probably have some homeless individuals, but I don't know about the services there or really that much about homelessness in South Dakota. But I know it gets very, very cold there in the winter and very hot there in the summer. And so hopefully they have made arrangements for anyone who finds themselves homeless in South Dakota, because yeah, people would definitely die if they had to stay outside in South Dakota for any length of time, particularly during the winter. There's no doubt about it. Minus 40 degrees temperature in the wintertime is a normal occurrence in South Dakota. With wind chill, the temperature will get down to below 100, 100 below zero in South Dakota. So it gets very, very cold there in the wintertime.
Did you say 100?
100 below zero, yeah. In the wintertime with wind chill, yeah. When you factor in the temperature and the wind chill, it will get below 100, 100 below zero, yeah. And yes, in fact, I have gone outside and played football in that weather. Me and my brother, when we had snow days, as we used to call them, and sometimes it would get very, very cold like that, we would, in fact, go outside and play. And we had to be very, very bundled up. And it takes a lot of clothing, a lot of layering, but yeah, we would go outside and play in that.
So we have 6 minutes left, which is probably not long enough. Can you explain the state that you came from, Florida?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Florida is. I heard last night again. I was watching some of the election news, and people were talking about Florida, and they were talking about it as kind of two different places almost. They were talking about Miami-Dade County and South Florida versus kind of the rest of Florida. But Florida is one of those states that has a lot of different geographics and a lot of different populations there. So yes, the South has a very high Latino community, a very large Latino community in the South, and obviously it's a very highly populated area around Miami, and a little bit in Tampa as well. And then as you move kind of up towards closer to Georgia or the north half of Florida, it just changes. It's a little bit different. It's more, I guess, what you would consider kind of rural Southern, I guess, is what most people would think of it as. And then you have the Panhandle as well, which is kind of more rural and Southern. So it's really different. There are a lot of different components there. And so it's just really varied across the entire state, depending on where you are in the state. People in Jacksonville, where I was at, are completely different than the people in Miami, who are completely different than the people in Tallahassee, where they have a large university crowd and a lot of university students there. So it's really varied across the entire state.
I've heard it said that it's like 5 states, kind of like Texas.
Yeah, it does kind of remind me of Texas that way a little bit. Yeah. Some people will say that there's southern Georgia, which is northern Florida, and then there's central Florida, which is really the tourist attractions, Disney and all of that, and then there's Miami, and then there's Tampa, and but everywhere you go, it's just so different from place to place. And then of course you have the Keys, which are completely different than anything else way down in the south of Florida, and it's just it's It's really varied depending on where you live in the state. Absolutely. Yeah, I would completely agree with that. It's like 5 different areas. Yeah.
I know we're not supposed to get too technical here, but do you remember how many COCs there are in Florida? You were like involved in like 7 of them alone.
I was
We've got
involved in
like
7 of
12 here in
them.
Texas. Like how many are there in Florida?
I want to say there's closer to 40 in Florida. They don't have a large balance of state in Florida. So most of the COCs are really covered by our actual COCs themselves. So there's considerably more COCs in Florida than there are here in Texas. Absolutely. Yeah.
Are you more optimistic about ending homelessness in Texas or in Florida? Forget Dallas for a second, just the state versus the state.
Wow, that's interesting. That's a good question. Wow. More optimistic about ending homelessness in Florida or Texas? I think, wow, that one's a difficult one. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, I know a little bit more about Florida in general, because I obviously spent more time there. Um, but there's some really good things that we're doing here in Texas too. Wow, that one's a good one. If I had to place my bets on who would end homelessness first, I don't know. I'd probably say Texas, honestly. I'd probably say Texas. I don't know why. I just think maybe there's a little more edge here in Texas. I don't know why exactly. Maybe it is because we have less continuums of care, so maybe it's easier to coordinate. But yeah, that's a good question. And I think we're right at our 30 minutes. And so I don't want to keep anybody from their day or anything like that. And I don't want to, run over too long. My hope is that next Coffee with Carl next month, what I'll talk about is I'll talk about my family and who my family is and kind of some of the characteristics of my family. And hopefully, that will be somewhat interesting to you, but also give you more perspective into who I am as a person and why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I want to say thank you to everybody listening and anybody who watches this being recorded. Thank you for the time. I appreciate you being here. And hopefully you got to learn a little bit more about me today. So thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you, Carl.
Bye.